Picture a market street in the city of Uruk 5,000 years ago. Mud brick walls bake in the sun. A trader is arguing with a farmer over a stack of grain sacks. One of them thinks the other is cheating him on weight. There is no policeman to call, no judge sitting nearby, no written rule either of them can point to. And yet, somehow, this argument will get settled. Somehow, this city of 30,000 strangers will not collapse into constant violence. How? That question is the whole story we're about to tell. And here's the twist: most people don't know before we even start. The law code you've probably heard of, the Code of Hammurabi, the famous eye for an eye one, wasn't first. Not even close. They're the law code 300 years older that barely anyone talks about, and it reveals something almost the opposite of an eye for an eye. We'll get there, but to understand why it mattered, we have to go back even further, to a time before cities, before kings, before a single law was ever written down. When everyone knows everyone. For most of the time our species has existed, there were no laws at all. Not bad laws, not unfair laws, none. Humans lived in small hunter-gatherer bands, usually a few dozen people, tied together by blood and marriage. And in a group that size, something happens that doesn't happen in a city. Nobody is anonymous. If you steal, if you lie, if you hurt someone, everyone knows by nightfall. There is nowhere to disappear to. Anthropologists studying groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the Jew/Hoansi in southern Africa have found something remarkable. Many of these societies have no chief with absolute power, no written code, no prison, and yet they are not chaotic. Order comes from something much older than any government. It comes from reputation. Try this thought experiment. Imagine your entire survival depended on 30 people trusting you enough to share food with you, hunt beside you, and watch your children when you couldn't. Now imagine everyone in that group of 30 is talking about you behind your back every single day. Who helped, who hoarded, who lied. That's not gossip in the way we use the word today. That was quite possibly the first justice system humanity ever built. No courtroom, just conversation and consequence. But reputation has a limit. What happens when someone doesn't just embarrass you? They kill your brother. Gossip can't fix that. So early human groups developed something anthropologists call self-help justice. The wrong family responded directly, sometimes with retaliation of their own. And around that retaliation, invisible boundaries started to form. Custom might say a killing from another family was owed a specific kind of payback, and going beyond that boundary made you the wrongdoer instead. No document said this. Nobody could point to a wall and show you the rule. But everybody knew it anyway, the same way everyone knew the words to a story passed down for generations. This worked. For tens of thousands of years, it worked, until it didn't. The problem with strangers. Here's where things start to crack. Reputation only works when everyone can actually keep track of everyone else. Anthropologists have long noted that humans seem to have a rough ceiling, somewhere around 150 people, for how many relationships we can meaningfully track at once. A hunting band of 30 is nowhere near that limit. A city is a different story entirely. Around 6,000 years ago, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq, that limit got smashed. This region, often called the cradle of civilization, saw the birth of the first true cities. Uruk alone eventually held tens of thousands of people. Suddenly, you had farmers who had never met soldiers, priests who had never met merchants, all packed into the same streets, all needing to trust each other enough to trade, marry, borrow, and build, and most of them total strangers. Gossip cannot govern a stranger. You can't ruin the reputation of someone whose name you don't even know. So cities needed something entirely new. A king, a palace, a temple that claimed to speak for the gods, and eventually, something that had never existed before in human history. A rule that didn't depend on anyone's memory at all. A rule you could carve into stone and walk away from, knowing it would still be there tomorrow. The king nobody remembers. Everyone assumes the first written laws belonged to Hammurabi. They didn't. Archaeologists digging in the ancient city of Ebla, in modern Syria, uncovered tablets dating back to around 2400 BCE, references to formal legal regulation older than anything Hammurabi ever touched. Even before that, in Sumer, a ruler named Urukagina is believed to have issued sweeping legal reforms in the 24th century BCE. We don't have his actual documents. They're gone. We only know they existed because later scribes mentioned them, a king's entire legal legacy surviving only as a rumor in someone else's paperwork. But the oldest surviving law code we can actually read, argue over, and study in real detail belongs to a king named Uarnemu, ruling the Sumerian city of Ur somewhere around 2100 to 2050 BCE. That's roughly 300 years before Hammurabi. When archaeologists first found fragments of Hammurabi's code in the early 20th century, they assumed it was the oldest legal document on Earth. It took further digging, literally, to prove them wrong. And here's what makes Uarnemu's code strange, in the best way. It is almost gentle. Picture two men fighting in a Sumerian street. One breaks the other's arm. Under many later legal systems, you might expect the attacker's arm to be broken in return. Under Uarnemu's code, in many cases, the punishment wasn't pain, it was silver. A payment, a debt owed to the person you'd wronged. That single choice tells you something about how Sumerians thought about justice. It wasn't about making the wrongdoer suffer. It was about restoring balance to the person who'd been harmed, closer to what we'd recognize today as a civil lawsuit than a criminal trial. Uarnemu himself described his own laws almost like a father laying down house rules, not punishing his kingdom, but organizing it the way you might organize an enormous, unruly family. More codes followed. The laws of Ishnana around 1930 BCE. The Code of Lipitishtar not long after. Each king refining the last king's answers to the same brutal questions. What do you owe a man whose ox gored your neighbor? What happens when a marriage falls apart? Who owns land when the river that fed it changes course? Slowly, painstakingly, Mesopotamia was building the operating system for civilization itself. Then, around 1754 BCE, a Babylonian king named Hammurabi did something that would make him famous for the next 4,000 years. He didn't just write laws. He carved 282 of them into an 8-foot pillar of polished black diorite, a stele, and put it up in public, where anyone walking through the city could see it. Stop and picture that stele for a second. Nearly 8 feet tall, black stone catching the sun. At the top, a carved relief of Hammurabi himself, standing before the god Shamash, as if to say, "This isn't just my law. This is divine law." And below that image, column after column of tiny cuneiform script, law after law after law, running down the stone like a waterfall of rules. Here's the detail almost nobody mentions. Most people walking past that stele couldn't read it. Literacy in Babylon was rare, reserved mostly for scribes and officials. So who is this 8-foot stone monument really for? Possibly not the average farmer at all. Possibly the scribes who'd cite it, the officials who'd enforce it, and whether Hammurabi knew it or not, us, the future, still reading his words 37 centuries later. But symbolically, the message mattered regardless of who could actually read it. The law exists. It is not secret. It is not something a noble can quietly bend behind closed doors. It's right there, in the open, for everyone to witness, even if not everyone could decode it. And Hammurabi's code covered an astonishing amount of daily life. Contracts, marriage, divorce, inheritance, the responsibilities of boat operators and builders. That last one is worth sitting with. If a builder constructed a house so badly it collapsed and killed the owner, the punishment could be severe enough to make a modern contractor's blood run cold. This is where the phrase most people actually recognize comes from: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Lawyers today still call this lex talionis, the law of retaliation. But here's the catch, and it's an important one. That eye for an eye punishment often depended entirely on who you were. A crime against a nobleman could carry a completely different penalty than the exact same crime against a commoner or an enslaved person, which tells us something that still echoes today. Writing a law down doesn't automatically make it fair. It just makes it visible. And visible isn't the same as equal. Not every ancient society made the same choice. Here's where the story gets genuinely surprising. A few centuries after Hammurabi, in the Hittite Empire, roughly 1650 to 1500 BCE, a very different legal code appeared. And in some ways, it was more humane than the laws that came before it. The Hittite code allowed enslaved people rights that would sound almost unthinkable in other ancient societies of the same era. The right to marry freely, the right to own property, even the right to purchase their own freedom. Think about that contrast for a second. Two civilizations separated by a few hundred years in a stretch of mountains, arriving at strikingly different answers to the exact same question. What do we owe the people at the bottom of our society? Ancient law was never one single story marching steadily toward justice. It was dozens of separate experiments, some kinder than others, and history did not move in a straight line toward fairness. Sometimes it moved sideways, sometimes backward. Fast forward 1,000 years. Rome, around 450 BCE, and this time, the law wasn't handed down by a king out of generosity, it was demanded. Roman legend says ordinary citizens, the plebeians, had grown sick of a legal system that lived entirely in the heads of the ruling class. Unwritten law, in the hands of the powerful, has a dangerous flexibility. It can mean one thing on Monday and something else entirely on Friday, depending on whose side you're on. So the plebeians pushed, and pushed hard, until the Romans carved a new set of laws onto 12 bronze tablets and mounted them in the Roman Forum, the beating public heart of the city. Whether every detail of that origin story is historically precise is still debated, but the principle behind it has outlived the empire itself. When a law lives only in the memory of the powerful can bend it. When a law is written down, in public, in bronze, even a plebeian arguing with a senator can point at the same 12 tablets and say, "Show me where I'm wrong." Now travel east, far enough that none of these empires had ever heard of each other. In India, between roughly 269 and 236 BCE, the Emperor Ashoka did something almost nobody else in the ancient world attempted. After winning a brutal, devastating war, he seemingly couldn't live with what he'd done. He converted to Buddhism, and instead of celebrating his conquest, he had edicts carved into pillars and rock faces across his empire. Not about punishment, but about nonviolence, morality, and social welfare. A king, carving regret into stone for his subjects to read. Meanwhile, in China, formal legal codes were developing on their own separate track entirely. By 624 CE, the Tang Code stood as one of the most comprehensive legal systems the ancient world had produced, a code so influential it would shape the legal systems of East Asia for centuries afterward. Here's the part that should genuinely stop you for a second. Mesopotamia, Rome, India, and China were not talking to each other. No trade route carried Hammurabi's stele to Rome. No messenger brought Uarnamu's silver payment system to India. These civilizations were separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and centuries of time, and yet every single one of them arrived at the same fundamental conclusion. Complex societies need written rules. Written rules need to be public. Public rules need enforcement. That pattern, appearing again and again, in total isolation from each other, suggests this isn't a cultural accident. It might be one of the most predictable things a large group of humans will ever do. What was actually being built? So step back and ask the real question. Why did any of this matter? Why did humans across 4 different continents independently decide they needed law? The honest answer is trust. Everything civilization is built on, trade, cities, farming at scale, strangers cooperating instead of killing each other, depends on people trusting one another, including people they will never personally meet. A written law is, in a strange way, a promise made visible. It tells a stranger in a marketplace, "You can trade with me because we both know the same rule applies to us both." It tells a farmer, "You can plant your crop and walk away for a season because ownership is now recorded and no neighbor can simply take it while you're gone." Law wasn't only about punishing people after something went wrong. Law was the thing that let large-scale human cooperation happen at all. And once that idea existed, it never disappeared. It just kept mutating. The unwritten customs of 30-person hunting bands became the oral traditions of growing villages. Oral tradition became Sumerian kings carving silver payment rules into clay. Sumerian law fed into Babylonian law into Hittite law, and centuries later, Roman law would go on to shape the legal DNA of most of Europe. Echoes of it are still sitting inside modern courtrooms today. Contracts, property rights, inheritance, the idea that punishment should fit the crime, the idea that law should be public instead of secret. None of this is recent. It was built argument by argument, tablet by tablet, king by king, over roughly 5,000 years. Here's the uncomfortable thought to leave you with. The very first laws in human history were rarely written just to punish people for the sake of it. Uarnamu wrote his laws to hold a kingdom together like a family. Hammurabi wrote his to make invisible power visible. Ashoka carved his into rock as an act of public regret. In almost every case, law was an attempt to build trust between strangers who had every reason not to trust each other at all. Whether that trust was ever truly equal, whether a commoner in Babylon really stood on the same ground as a nobleman, whether an enslaved person in Sumer had anything close to the freedom a Hittite law might have offered, is something historians still argue about today. The deeper you dig into these ancient codes, the more you notice the same fault lines we're still standing on. Power against justice, the wealthy against the poor, the law as it's written against the law as it's actually lived. Which leaves one last question worth sitting with. If our earliest ancestors managed to hold entire societies together using nothing but memory, reputation, and shared trust, no courts, no police, not a single word carved in a stone, then maybe civilization was never really about the rules themselves. Maybe it was about something older, something wired into us long before the first law was ever written down. And if that's true, the real mystery isn't how ancient humans invented their first laws. The real mystery is what other invisible systems, lost to history, once held human beings together, long before anyone thought to write anything down at all.